The morning of August 29th, 2005, the winds had stopped, the sky had gone quiet, and for one brief moment, officials in Washington told the American people that New Orleans had survived. They were wrong. What came next was not a continuation of the storm, it was something far more disturbing. A catastrophe that the most powerful country on earth watched happen in real time and could not stop, or chose not to. This story does not end where most people think it does, and the full truth of it has never been more important. Stay with us until the very end. Like and subscribe so you never miss a documentary like this one. To understand what happened in New Orleans in the summer of 2005, you first have to understand the city itself, because New Orleans is unlike any other place in the United States. It was born from a gamble, it grew through contradiction, and it survived for nearly 3 centuries on a combination of engineering, culture, and sheer stubbornness. But underneath all of it, there was always the water. When French explorer Jean-Baptiste de Bienville founded the settlement in 1718, he chose a piece of land along a narrow natural ridge formed by centuries of sediment deposited by the Mississippi River. He understood the risk. Reports from French traders had warned that the land flooded regularly and that the site was unsuitable for permanent settlement. Bienville built anyway. The strategic value of controlling the mouth of the Mississippi River, the gateway to the entire interior of the North American continent, was too great to pass up, and so the city was planted in a place that nature never quite intended. For generations, New Orleans grew along that high ground near the river. The French Quarter, which still stands today as one of the most recognizable neighborhoods in the world, was built on that ridge. Its famous wrought iron balconies and Spanish colonial architecture sit on some of the highest natural ground in the city. This is precisely why it survived what came later with minimal flooding. But as the population grew and the city expanded outward, developers began draining the swampland that surrounded the original settlement. They pumped water out of low-lying marshes and built neighborhoods on what had once been wetland. These neighborhoods sat below the level of the surrounding water and were held dry only by the walls built around them. The levee system that protected New Orleans was not one single structure, but a vast network of earthen walls, concrete barriers, and flood walls stretching across hundreds of miles, all of it designed to hold back the Mississippi River to the south and Lake Pontchartrain to the north. The lake is enormous, a shallow inland sea sitting just above the city, and when a hurricane pushed water across its surface, that surge had nowhere to go except toward New Orleans. The city sat in a bowl lower than the lake, lower than the river, held in place by walls that everyone hoped would hold. The Army Corps of Engineers had been responsible for the design and construction of those flood protection structures since a major flood control act was passed in 1965. That year, Hurricane Betsy had inundated parts of the city and killed dozens of people. Congress responded by funding a massive upgrade to the levee system. The walls were reinforced and new concrete flood walls were installed along the city's drainage canals. They were designed to handle a Category 3 storm, but here was the problem no one wanted to face publicly. Over the following decades, the land beneath New Orleans had been slowly sinking. The process, known as subsidence, happens naturally in delta regions as soft sediment compresses under its own weight, but it was dramatically accelerated by the very levees built to protect the city. Before those walls were constructed, the Mississippi flooded its banks every spring, depositing fresh layers of sediment across the floodplain. Once the levees stopped those floods, the sediment stopped coming and the land began to sink. By 2005, the lowest neighborhoods in New Orleans sat 6 feet below sea level, protected by walls that had never been updated to account for how far the ground had fallen beneath them. Scientists were not unaware of this. A year before Katrina, a federal agency funded a simulation exercise called Hurricane Pam, which modeled exactly what would happen if a strong storm struck New Orleans. The results were unambiguous. The levees would fail, the city would flood, thousands of people could die. The report was completed, distributed to relevant agencies, and then, essentially, nothing happened. There was one more dimension to this city that would matter enormously when the storm arrived: the geography of who lived where. The oldest and highest neighborhoods, the French Quarter, the Garden District, the wealthier areas uptown, were built on higher ground along the river. The newer, lower-lying neighborhoods carved from former swampland were overwhelmingly home to black, working-class families. The lower Ninth Ward, New Orleans East, Gentilly. These communities were not built on vulnerable ground by accident. They sat in the lowest parts of the city because they were the last places developed, and the places where the poorest residents had settled because they had the fewest options. When the water came, it would follow the contours of the land, and those contours had been shaped over generations by inequality. In late August of 2005, the Gulf of Mexico was running unusually warm. The surface water temperatures had climbed well above their normal range, and for a hurricane, warm water is everything. It is the fuel, the engine, the reason a storm grows or weakens. A small tropical disturbance that had formed quietly over the Bahamas was about to encounter that fuel, and the result would be one of the most powerful Atlantic hurricanes ever recorded. The system was initially unremarkable. It strengthened gradually, received a name, and made its first landfall over southern Florida as a relatively modest hurricane, crossing the Miami area with enough force to knock out power and kill a handful of people. Then it crossed the peninsula, weakened briefly over land, and entered the Gulf of Mexico. What happened next was breathtaking in its speed. Within 24 hours of entering the Gulf, the storm had reached Category 3. Within another 24 hours, it was Category 5, the highest classification on the scale, with sustained winds of 175 miles per hour. Its central pressure dropped to a level that ranked it among the most intense Atlantic storms ever measured. At its peak, the storm's circulation was so enormous that it covered the entire Gulf of Mexico from shore to shore. Hurricane Hunter aircraft flying into the eye described a storm of incomprehensible scale. One meteorologist later said that when they flew into it, the storm's structure reached as far as they could see in every direction. The National Hurricane Center had been tracking this with mounting alarm. Its director, Max Mayfield, took the extraordinary step of personally calling the mayor of New Orleans and the governor of Louisiana on the evening before landfall. This was not standard procedure. Mayfield reached out because he understood that standard procedures were not adequate for what he was looking at. He told them plainly, this storm would cause devastating flooding. The levees might be overwhelmed, and the city needed to be evacuated immediately. He was speaking with the directness of someone watching a catastrophe form in real time. The mayor of New Orleans, Ray Nagin, issued what had never been issued in the city's nearly 300-year history, a mandatory evacuation order. This was significant because New Orleans had a deep culture of weathering storms. Many residents had developed a habit of riding them out, trusting the levees, trusting that their neighborhood had come through the last storm and would come through this one. This time, the mayor told everyone to leave. The highways leading out of the city were converted to carry traffic in one direction only, all lanes pointing away from the coast. The results were remarkable. An estimated 80% of the metropolitan population got out, something like 1 million people pouring onto the highways, driving to Baton Rouge, Houston, and cities across the South and Midwest. It was one of the largest civilian evacuations in American history, but 20% stayed. Roughly 100,000 people, some refused to believe the storm would be as severe as described. Some were elderly residents with nowhere to go and no means to get there. Some were in hospitals connected to machines that could not be easily moved. And a very large number, concentrated overwhelmingly in the lowest-lying neighborhoods, simply did not have cars, did not have money for hotels, and did not have family elsewhere who could take them in. They stayed because they had no practical alternative. A 15-year-old girl named Morgan Archer, who stayed with her family in New Orleans that night, wrote in her diary that she was scared because she thought they might drown. The Louisiana Superdome was designated as what officials called a shelter of last resort. The phrase acknowledged, without quite saying so, that this was not a good option. It was simply the least bad one for those who could not leave. The National Guard delivered some food and water, a fraction of what had been promised. There were no chemical toilets, no designated medical staff, and generator fuel for perhaps 72 hours. 10,000 people filed through the doors in the hours before the storm arrived. The storm weakened slightly in its final approach as it moved over cooler shelf waters near the coast. Some would later cite this as evidence the storm was not as severe as feared. This missed the essential point entirely. A hurricane generates its storm surge based on the energy it has accumulated over days, not the intensity it carries at the moment of landfall. Katrina had been a Category 5 for an extended period over the Gulf. The surge it had built was enormous and was already moving toward the coast regardless of what the winds did in those final hours. Before the storm even made official landfall, the city was already being destroyed. At 5 o'clock in the morning, while the eye was still offshore and the winds were still building, a section of concrete flood wall along the industrial canal on the eastern edge of the city gave way. The canal ran through the heart of the lower Ninth Ward, a community of black homeowners who had lived there for generations in the shadow of the canal walls. The wall failed not because water rose over its top, but because water had seeped beneath its foundation through weak soil, destabilizing the base of the structure until it collapsed. An empty barge moored in the canal broke free in the storm and was carried through the breach directly into the neighborhood, destroying everything in its path. What happened in those first minutes was unlike anything else in the disaster. The water came in so fast and with such violence that houses were lifted off their foundations. People who were asleep had almost no time to react. Those who made it to their attics found themselves in darkness, in rising water with no way out. Some had heeded the mayor's earlier advice to keep an axe in the attic. Those who had one cut through their own rooftops to reach the air. Those who did not faced the water alone. As dawn broke, more walls were giving way. Along the London Avenue Canal, concrete monoliths failed on both sides of the waterway, sending floodwaters into the Gentilly neighborhood. Near the western edge of the city, on the 17th Street Canal, the largest drainage canal in New Orleans, another section of concrete flood wall collapsed. Engineers who later investigated found that this wall had not been overtopped by rising water. It had been undermined. A thin layer of sensitive clay in the soil beneath the foundation had given way under lateral pressure. 3 fire captains confirmed with video evidence that the wall fell before the water reached its crest. It was a structural failure caused by a design flaw, not an act of nature that exceeded what the walls were built to handle. And once that wall was gone, floodwaters poured through the gap and continued flowing into the city for the next 2.5 days, long after the storm had passed. Because the breach had carved a pathway below sea level that the water simply followed continuously. By the end of that first day, 53 total failure points had been documented across all flood protection structures in the greater New Orleans area. The American Society of Civil Engineers would later call it the worst engineering catastrophe in United States history. While New Orleans was flooding, the storm was simultaneously devastating the Mississippi Gulf Coast in ways the national media would spend far less time covering. The Eye made its final landfall near Pearlington, right on the Louisiana-Mississippi border, and the right side of the storm, always the most powerful quadrant, delivered a surge close to 30 feet in some locations. For context, that is the height of a 3-story building coming ashore at tremendous speed. The entire 70-mile coastline of Mississippi was swallowed. Pass Christian was completely destroyed. Waveland was erased from the landscape, leaving only concrete slabs where neighborhoods had stood for generations. 2 major coastal bridges collapsed. More than half of Mississippi's 13 riverboat casinos, which were floated on barges in the water to comply with state gambling laws, were picked up by the surge and deposited hundreds of yards inland. Preliminary estimates placed the destruction of structures within half a mile of the coastline at 90%. Former Mississippi Governor Haley Barbour flew over his state the following day and said it looked like the hand of God had wiped away the coast. 238 people died in Mississippi. Their story, overshadowed almost immediately by what was unfolding in New Orleans, became one of the lesser-told chapters of an event that was already too large for any single telling. When the sun rose over New Orleans on the morning after landfall, the city that emerged was unrecognizable. Streets were rivers. Entire blocks sat under 8, 10, 15 feet of brown, contaminated water carrying debris, sewage, chemicals from flooded industrial sites, and the wreckage of everything swept through on its way in. Rooftops emerged like small islands from the surface, and on nearly every rooftop within sight there were people. Families who had ridden out the storm in their attics, who had broken through to their roofs when the water rose too fast, were now sitting in the August heat under the open Louisiana sun, waving at anything moving in the sky, spelling out addresses and pleas in spray paint across the shingles. From above, it was one of the most haunting sights in American history, a great city reduced to a collection of rooftop islands populated by people waiting for someone to come. Some help came immediately. The Coast Guard launched rescue operations almost before the storm had finished passing. Helicopters were in the air, rescue swimmers were deployed into the floodwaters, and boats began navigating the debris-choked streets before any coordinated federal response had been organized. Over the following days, the Coast Guard rescued more than 33,000 people, the largest air and water rescue operation the country had ever conducted. The men and women who flew those missions worked without sleep and without breaks. They simply kept going. Private citizens did the same. People who owned fishing boats and flat-bottomed boats launched them into the floodwaters and began pulling neighbors off rooftops without waiting for instructions from anyone. They navigated streets they had driven 100 times, now completely submerged, reading the tops of stop signs to know where they were. They pulled out elderly people, pregnant women, children, people in wheelchairs. They did not stop to ask whether they were authorized inside the Superdome. Conditions had deteriorated rapidly. The storm had partially torn away sections of the roof, leaving gaps through which wind and rain came in. The generators failed, plunging the interior into near darkness. The air conditioning was gone, and the August heat was relentless. Temperatures inside climbed past 100 degrees. The toilets stopped functioning. The food and water that had been prepositioned was running out. People who had medical conditions found no staff to help them. The original 10,000 arrivals were joined by thousands more, fleeing the rising streets outside, bringing the total population of the dome to something approaching 26,000 people. 6 people died inside the building over those days. The convention center was a separate crisis that the government did not even know was happening for 2 days. Nobody had officially designated it as a shelter. But tens of thousands of people had made their way there on their own, wading through chest-high water, arriving with nothing, desperate for any dry ground and any human presence. They sat in the heat with no food, no water, no medical attention, and no security. At least 4 people died there before any official help arrived. When journalists finally reached the building and broadcast what they found, much of the country saw the situation for the first time alongside the rest of the world. At St. Rita's nursing home in the neighbouring St. Bernard parish, the owners had been told before the storm to evacuate. They decided the building was strong enough to shelter in place. The surge that hit St. Bernard parish was devastating. The nursing home flooded. 35 elderly residents drowned, unable to move and unable to escape, trapped in a building that was supposed to protect them. The owners were later convicted of negligent homicide. At Memorial Medical Center, doctors and nurses were trapped inside with critically ill patients. No power, no running water, temperatures climbing past 100 degrees, and the lower floors of the building submerged. Patients who needed ventilators and dialysis had no way to receive them. The decisions made inside that hospital during those 5 days would be investigated for years and would raise profound questions about what medicine can and cannot do when every system supporting it has collapsed entirely. Then the rumors began, and they changed everything. Reports spread through official channels and national media of mass violence inside the Superdome and the convention center, of murders and people firing at rescue helicopters. Officials repeated these reports. Broadcasts amplified them. The vast majority turned out to be false or wildly exaggerated. But the narrative of widespread criminal violence gave authorities a reason or an excuse to treat the people trapped there as threats rather than as victims who needed urgent help. It shaped the speed and character of the response in ways that cost lives. On the morning the storm made landfall, the head of the Federal Emergency Management Agency sent guidance to fire and emergency services departments across the country. The guidance said they should not deploy to affected areas without being formally requested and officially dispatched through proper channels. The city was drowning. The instruction was to wait for paperwork. This was not an isolated decision. It was the visible expression of a system built for ordinary disasters that had no architecture for something of this scale. The National Response Plan governing federal disaster response required a specific declaration before the full weight of federal resources could be activated. The Secretary of Homeland Security had to make that declaration. He did not make it until 36 hours after landfall. In those 36 hours, people were dying on rooftops, in attics, and in the corners of overwhelmed shelters with no supplies. The specific failures were concrete and documented. Before the storm made landfall, Amtrak had offered to evacuate residents on trains already leaving the city empty. The offer was declined. The American Bus Association tried to reach federal officials to offer buses. They could not get anyone on the phone. Walmart prepared trucks loaded with water and drove them toward New Orleans. They were turned away. The Coast Guard attempted to deliver diesel fuel to pumping stations that desperately needed it. They were told they could not. The Red Cross was denied access to the Superdome to deliver emergency supplies. Officials explained that if people were made comfortable there, they might not want to leave, which would complicate an evacuation that had not yet been executed. Germany had prepared a cargo plane full of emergency equipment. That offer went without response for 9 days. Communications between federal, state, and local agencies had collapsed almost entirely. Different agencies used incompatible equipment and could not speak to each other. Nobody was certain who had authority over what. When rescue teams made successful recoveries, there was no formal system to direct them on where to bring survivors. Multiple rescue crews were sent to the same flooded streets, while other areas were left completely uncovered for days. People rescued from rooftops were dropped at highway overpasses and told to wait for buses that did not arrive. 200 people were rescued from their homes and deposited on an elevated section of overpass to be collected later. They were forgotten. They waited in the August sun with no food, no water, and no information. A congressional investigation conducted afterward, signed by members of both political parties, produced a report whose title communicated everything the text inside took hundreds of pages to say, a failure of initiative. Mayor Nagin had made his own failure before the storm. 200 school buses sat in a municipal parking lot in New Orleans, dry and operational, in the days before the hurricane. He chose not to deploy them for evacuation, citing insurance concerns and a shortage of qualified drivers. Those buses were photographed sitting dry before the storm and submerged a week later. That image became one of the defining symbols of local government failure in the entire disaster. President Bush was at his ranch in Texas when the storm made landfall. He had been briefed by video conference the night before, shown the warnings and informed of the worst-case projections. He asked no questions. 4 days after the storm, Air Force One flew over New Orleans at 2,500 feet. A photograph was taken of the president looking down at the flooded city from the window of the plane. He did not land. That image, a president observing a drowning American city from above without stopping, became one of the most politically devastating photographs of his presidency. The director of FEMA resigned 5 weeks after the hurricane. Congressional hearings ran for months. Witnesses described a federal bureaucracy so focused on process and procedure that it had become incapable of responding to anything outside its pre-approved frameworks. Aid arrived late, in the wrong places, in quantities that were a fraction of what was needed, or did not arrive at all. The investigation exposed something that had been visible in the disaster itself, and that many Americans watching the coverage had already said out loud. The people who were trapped were disproportionately black, disproportionately poor, and disproportionately from communities that had received the least investment in infrastructure and the least urgency in response. 10 years after the storm, President Barack Obama said plainly that what had begun as a natural disaster had become a man-made disaster, a failure of government to look out for its own citizens. The levees had been built by the government. The warnings had been issued by the government. The help had been delayed by the government, and the people who paid the highest price had been telling anyone who would listen for decades that they were the most vulnerable and had not been heard. When the floodwaters were finally pumped out of New Orleans, which took weeks, what was revealed underneath was not just the wreckage of a storm, it was the wreckage of an entire way of life. Nearly 1,400 people died as a direct result of the hurricane and the flooding. In Louisiana alone, confirmed deaths exceeded 1,200. Hundreds more remained listed as missing for years. Across the Gulf Coast, more than 200,000 homes were severely damaged or destroyed. The entire medical infrastructure of New Orleans, the hospitals, the clinics, the public health network that had served its residents for generations, was effectively wiped out. Charity Hospital, one of the oldest public hospitals in the country, and the place where tens of thousands of poor New Orleanians had received care for over a century, never reopened. The city's population, which had been close to 500,000 people before the storm, collapsed to roughly a fifth of that in the months that followed as residents scattered across America. The Army Corps of Engineers admitted publicly, in a report issued the following year, that faulty design specifications, incomplete construction, and the use of substandard materials in sections of the levee system had directly contributed to the failures that flooded the city. A federal judge later ruled that the Corps bore responsibility for the 17th Street Canal failure, specifically, but because of a law passed in 1928 that grants the Army Corps immunity from financial liability for flood control projects, No compensation could be ordered for the families of those who had drowned behind walls the federal government had built inadequately. The judge could rule. He could not make them pay. The federal government eventually committed billions of dollars to rebuilding the flood protection system, replacing the failed structures with stronger designs, installing massive floodgates at the mouths of the drainage canals, and strengthening hundreds of miles of levees. Engineers called it the most significant investment in urban flood protection the nation had ever undertaken. It also confirmed implicitly what many had been warning for years, that the old system had been inadequate all along, which meant that what happened in 2005 had been, to a significant degree, preventable. Recovery in New Orleans was not equal, and it was not fast. The wealthier neighborhoods, those on higher ground with better insurance coverage and residents who had the resources to navigate complex federal assistance programs, came back relatively quickly. The French Quarter reopened. Hotels welcomed guests within months. But in the lower Ninth Ward, where the flooding had been most catastrophic, the recovery moved at an entirely different pace. A neighborhood that had housed nearly 20,000 people before the storm was still largely empty years later. Residents who had been scattered to cities across the country found themselves caught between the desire to return home and a reality in which home no longer existed in any practical sense. Federal loan programs intended to help with rebuilding were administered in ways that critics and independent analysts described as racially biased, with applications from black homeowners being approved at significantly lower rates. Affordable housing that had been demolished after the storm was not rebuilt in sufficient quantities. The people who had been most vulnerable before the storm became the most forgotten after it. What survived was something harder to quantify than any of the physical things that were lost. The culture of New Orleans, the jazz and the brass bands and the second-line parades, and the food and the particular way the city had always managed to grieve and celebrate at the same time, survived because the people carried it with them when they left. Just months after residents were allowed to return, the city's social clubs organized the first second-line parade since the disaster. These parades have their roots in African-American jazz funeral traditions, in which family members and friends march behind a brass band, celebrating a life even as they mourn its passing. On that day in 2006, participants held up street signs bearing the names of their neighborhoods, streets named Desire and Murray, and the gesture said what no official statement could have expressed more clearly: "We belong here, and we are still here." The name of the storm was retired by international meteorological authorities the following spring. It will never be assigned to another storm. The name Katrina now belongs entirely to this event, to these weeks, to this chapter in American history that fundamentally changed how the country understood itself. 20 years later, the city's population stood at around 380,000 people, roughly three-quarters of what it had been before. Some neighborhoods thrived, others never fully came back. A museum opened beside the London Avenue Canal, inside a gutted house, recreating what flooded interiors looked like in the weeks after the disaster, so that the reality of it could not be softened by time. Survivors organized annual marches, moments of silence, and public conversations about what had been learned and what had not. What had not been learned is the part of this story that makes it more than history. Every year, on the morning of August 29th, a brass band walks through the streets of New Orleans, and the people who remain follow behind it, the way New Orleanians have always walked behind music, forward into whatever comes next. They play for the ones who made it, and for the ones who did not, for the city that came back, and for the parts of it that never did, and for the truth that a disaster of this magnitude is never simply a story about water. It is always, in the end, a story about people, about the choices made before the storm arrived, about who was protected and who was left exposed, and about what a society reveals about itself when everything it has built is tested all at once.